My guest is George Hawley, Assistant Professor of Political Science at University of Alabama and author of Making Sense of the Alt-Right and the book Right-Wing Critics of American Conservatism. His website is georgehawley.com. That's H-A-W-L-E-Y. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So you've got this book. You show your copy. I have a galley copy. Here you go. Making Sense of the Alt-Right. You've got this book, Making Sense of the Alt-Right. What's the Alt-Right?
The alt-right, broadly speaking, is the current manifestation of the white nationalist movement in the United States. That is, it's a movement that is ideologically committed to the goal of creating an ethnically or racially pure ethno-state in North America. Okay, now,
recently there's also been a characterization of the alt-left.
Yes, that's a term that's been pushed by elements of conservative media for a couple of months now, most notably Sean Hannity and a few other folks on talk radio. There's not really such a thing as the alt-left. No one really uses that term to describe themselves. There is certainly a radical left and indeed a violent left, but in terms of there being any kind of formal movement called the alt-left, the answer to that is no.
All right, so it's basically a propaganda ploy by Hannity and friends.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so you talk in your book about how this is white supremacy, but you don't call it that in the book, and there are basically a number of reasons why and ways that the alt-right characterizes itself. So talk about that.
Well, I should be clear here. In the popular press, the general standard is to describe all racist ideologies as white supremacist. And I don't disagree with that standard. I did not have any complaints, for example, when the Associated Press put out new guidelines for how the alt-right should be described, saying that it should always be mentioned that it is, to some extent, a white supremacist movement. But from my perspective, approaching it from an academic perspective, as opposed to something that's going to be in major newspapers, I prefer to be a little bit more clear and notice some of the gradations within these movements, just to get a better sense of what's going on and what the people within them are actually saying. So I want to be clear that I am not challenging that standard of using the term white supremacist in the media to describe these movements. But in terms of how the alt-right and related movements describe themselves, the term white supremacist is generally avoided, preferring the term white nationalist or ethnic.
Well, basically, if you're going to be called a white supremacist, then the people who are calling you that are thinking that you're a scumbag, or a lowlife, or a hater. And I guess they're using other framing that they feel is more palatable to the mainstream.
I think part of it is a marketing thing, definitely. Another element, though, is within those circles, they say that there's a distinction between white supremacy and white nationalism. That is, they would say that a white supremacist ideology would be something like, say, the Jim Crow South or apartheid South Africa. That is where racial diversity is a reality, but the social hierarchy and the economics are deliberately designed to benefit whites. Whereas they would say that the white nationalist perspective is that they want to live in a whites-only society. That is, it's not just that whites are superior or held superior to other groups, but other groups are simply not even there. And one can argue as to whether that is actually a superior system or not, or ever be realized. But that's the distinction that they make within those circles.
Okay, so who is your typical alt-right person?
Well, gathering hard data on this is difficult because of the rather amorphous and still mostly anonymous nature of the movement. But I will say that it is qualitatively different from earlier manifestations of this ideology, thinking about, say, groups from the 90s like the National Alliance or the Aryan Nations or the KKK, in that the alt-right does strike me as a younger movement, younger people being involved with it, and on average probably a more educated movement than what we saw in these earlier groups.
So in the book, I think you refer to them as millennials.
Mostly, yeah, I think that's true. That the people creating lots of the content, even the older ones, are still, I would say, part of Generation X. And I think that most of the people consuming the content are in their 20s and early 30s.
Okay, and you say this has been primarily facilitated by the internet.
I think that's definitely true. I think without the internet, it really couldn't exist, because that's what makes the alt-right rather different from those earlier groups I just mentioned, that it's not really a group or an organization. It's mostly just this rather disorganized online mob that, loosely shares some basic ideas and will engage in things like trolling and posting, racist content in various venues.
And you say trolling is important to the roots of this. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, starting, I'd say as recently as 2015, the online racist right was really a fairly small and marginal part of the internet ecosphere. There were obviously plenty of places where you could find that sort of content. You could go to Stormfront and, look at all the material there. All of these different ideologies had their own websites and blogs and podcasts, etc. But if you weren't going out and seeking that kind of content, you weren't necessarily going to find it. And even if it popped up in a Google search and you clicked through it, you would immediately see what it was. And, if you weren't interested, you would leave. But what the alt-right discovered around 2015, started to do this more effectively, was that it could, in a sense, act as a parasite on people with much bigger platforms. Really, I think that Twitter was a major game changer, that because of the ease with which there could be direct communication between individuals, including anonymous individuals and people who had many tens of thousands of followers or hundreds of thousands of followers. And so by engaging in sort of a relentless trolling and harassment campaign against prominent journalists and celebrities, and creating this impression that there was this growing and significant white nationalist movement on the internet, they were able to draw a lot more of attention to themselves than they had been able to previously.
Talk a little bit more about what that trolling looks like when they go on Twitter or anywhere else.
Well, if there were certain types of people who were most likely to get targeted. It seemed journalists, especially high-profile journalists, were likely to just be inundated with extremely nasty remarks. In some cases, things more serious, such as doxing these people, that is, releasing their personal information and making sure that nasty emails were sent to them, perhaps even things sent to their home address. All of these things gave the impression to these opinion makers that this was something very serious that needed to be written about and discussed, and they started to do so. Other people who were likely to be the target of alt-right rage were anyone who was anti-Trump, notably anti-Trump conservatives. Sort of the Never Trump movement was a particularly hated element of the world of journalism throughout the 2016 election. And Jewish journalists and celebrities were also very likely to be on the receiving end of these remarks.
Okay, because there were a couple of other questions that I had for you that you kind of just bring up there. One is white supremacism evokes the idea of racism, but these are also anti-Semites as well. When we looked at Charleston, there were some prominent videos of chanting against Jews even.
Yes, though it's worth noting that in this case, they don't really, to disaggregate racism from anti-Semitism isn't necessarily correct, because the alt-right tends to view Jews as being not white. That is, their problem with them isn't their religion, because the alt-right is not on average a particularly religious movement. Their problem is that they view them as a hostile ethnic group as opposed to a hostile religious group. So I would lump their anti-Semitism as being part of the same category as an person of color status in general.
I'm not quite clear on that. You said anti-ethnic. So would they have a similar aversion to Italians or Irish?
No, I should be clear. They view Jews as being a distinct racial group. I should have clarified that.
So racial.
Mm-hmm. And this goes back to works by prominent people in the movement, such as a retired professor named Kevin MacDonald, who wrote a number of books arguing that Jews represent a distinct racial group that is hostile to the interests of Europeans and white Americans.
And this shows, now, are there prominent websites for alt-right?
Yes. There are many dozens, probably hundreds of alt-right websites, but some of the bigger ones would include places like The Right Stuff. A relatively newcomer on the scene is one called altright.com. That was started by Richard Spencer. Although it is much older than the alt-right itself, American Renaissance is a place where a lot of this material gets published. And until very recently, the Daily Stormer was the most visited of these websites, but that has really been pushed off of the internet. Now you can only access it through the dark web.
Okay, yeah, that was nice to see, actually. And I have ambivalent feelings about it because, if they take them off, who's next?
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern. I think a lot of people crowing about Andrew Anglin not being allowed on the internet because a number of corporations said that they wouldn't host him. I'm a little bit concerned about that precedent because we're allowing basically corporate interests to decide who will be allowed on this platform or not, and that's really a kind of a new development in the history of the internet. So I will be watching where that goes with interest in the months and years ahead.
Well, a recent interview that I did with Trevor Schultz was about the big platforms, the giant platforms that are basically, I think in a lot of ways, threats because they are making those kinds of decisions. Mm-hmm. They're threats to democracy in some ways, as well as to workers, of course. So I think I titled that Platform Cooperativism, if you want to look that up. It's powerful stuff. And what percentage of the population do you think represents alt-right?
I would say it's still very small. There was a recent poll, I believe, done by the Washington Post indicating that something like 10% of the American population identifies with the alt-right. I am almost entirely certain that that is wrong. Because if that's true, that suggests that there are 20 million alt-right supporters in America, and I think that is an order of magnitude too large. Now, getting hard numbers is very difficult because the alt-right is not an organization, so it doesn't have things like membership lists. But if you were to go by, say, website traffic, which I think is a reasonable way to go here, because as a movement that lives on the internet, I couldn't imagine that anyone would seriously identify with the alt-right without also visiting its major internet platforms. And if you're going on that, then the numbers would probably be in the hundreds of thousands in terms of the number of people who are regularly consuming this material. And regularly consuming the material doesn't even necessarily mean they will do anything about it, but it does mean that they're reading it. Now we can say that that number is far too high, but it suggests that the alt-right is, to some degree, an overhyped movement, that it's described as being larger and more menacing than it probably really is.
Okay. So this is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show, and we'll take a station break right here that I'll insert. You say in your book that they say some pretty appalling things. keeping in mind that this does go out on the radio, so don't use foul language. But what do they say?
Well, I wouldn't, without repeating any of the things they say, it's at least directly, it is very eager to use the most prominent and well-known and appalling racial slurs, religious slurs. And it also is in the business.
You're talking about blacks and Jews there.
Yes, and Hispanics and Muslims, etc. And it's also in the business of coining new slurs that sort of become sort of inside jokes within the movement, things that to people outside of the alt-right, it might not even be immediately clear what exactly they're talking about. To use one of the less vulgar terms that has really achieved prominence, the alt-right coined the term cuckservative in the 2016 election. That's obviously not a racial slur, but it's a reference to conservatives who they view as being insufficiently racist. That is, and it's a combination of the word conservative with cuckold, saying that these are conservatives who are not looking out for their own racial best interest and should be mocked for that reason.
And you've said they're opposed to George W. Bush and especially to the neoconservative wing of the conservative movement. So libertarians and paleoconservatives and the racial right all could be classified as alt-right, though over time the racial element became more explicit. So libertarians and neoconservatives are something. Now, libertarians are part of the alt-right?
No, we should maybe say a little bit of the history here. When the term alt-right was first coined back in 2008, it really was a fairly broad term that when Richard Spencer first started using it, it could really apply to just about anyone who was right-wing, but who rejected George W. Bush style conservatism. So it was anyone who was right-wing, but an alternative to that could have been considered part of the alternative. Right?
What does the George Bush conservative mean? Is that like a neoconservative?
Yeah, so the conservatism of championing things like the Iraq War, the conservatism that was very in favor of anything that Wall Street wanted. Many things that, you could oppose without having any necessary racial animus. But over time, the term started to become more explicitly racial. And this definitely became true, especially after Richard Spencer left his position at Talkies magazine to take a position running a new website called AlternativeRight.com, which still had all of those other elements, but made the racial angle much more explicit.
Talk a little bit about that website.
It was, I would say that when that website, which no longer exists, but when it came online in around 2010, it still had lots of material that was anti-war, lots of material that had some libertarian-style writings about economics, and some stuff generally taking on culture from a right-wing perspective. But it also began pushing the racial angle a lot more heavily than other mainstream conservative websites at the time. Pushing articles, for example, arguing that racial differences are rooted ultimately in genetics as opposed to race being a social construct, that sort of thing.
Okay. I want to make sure before we went on the air, I talked to you a little bit about bottom up, and I call the show bottom up because I think we're transitioning from a top down to a more bottom up culture, and I'm always looking for bottom up angles. And you mentioned how the bottom up of the internet had affected the way that ideology could be controlled by conservatives. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, when we think about the conservative movement going really from, say, the 1950s until the early 2000s, the biggest name of that movement was most definitely William F. Buckley Jr. And a big part of his project was engaging in periodic house cleaning of the mainstream conservative movement. That is, of declaring certain views and certain people outside of acceptable boundaries and essentially shunning them from the movement, and as a result, shunning them from public life. So we saw this, we saw early cases of this with, say, the John Birch Society, where William F. Buckley basically declared war on Robert Welch and the Birchers, and played a pivotal role in dramatically diminishing that organization and its conspiracy-minded version of conservatism. We'd see smaller cases like when Buckley and his allies declared that the conservative movement would have nothing to do with Ayn Rand and her objectivist movement. We saw individual cases such as when Buckley broke all ties with Revelo Oliver, who became a very outspoken anti-Semite. In the 1980s, Buckley and National Review were very forceful in denouncing David Duke, and would later on denounce Pat Buchanan. So there was this powerful organized conservative effort to really define the boundaries of what was acceptable conservative discourse. And if you crossed that line, you really were kind of ceased to exist in public discourse, because if you were a conservative and you didn't have access to National Review or any of the major conservative publications, you had no way to spread your message. You were basically stuck, engaging in cheap pamphleteering or, running small newsletters. You had no more platform. That is no longer really the case. The internet doesn't have gates in that regard. So there's no way for there to be a conservative gatekeeper. So right-wing thought that previously could only survive on the margins is now able to insert itself into public discourse in a way that had previously not been possible.
And if you can get a troll with 100 Twitter followers to provoke and engage someone with 100,000 or 500,000 and get them to respond, then there's a lot of power there.
I think so, yeah. And to make matters worse for the conservative movement is I think that they've also just lost a lot of the credibility that they used to have. I think that as the original, alt-right manifestation was appearing towards the end of the Bush administration, I think that the sort of the marquee names of the conservative movement just didn't have that much pull over ordinary Americans the way that they once did. Especially after Buckley passed away, there really wasn't anyone to sort of be the conservative pope anymore. And I think a lot of interest in mainstream conservatism started to fade away just because the Bush years were disastrous on a number of levels, sort of opening up people to potentially different and maybe even more radical ideas than might have been the case had the conservative brand been a little bit stronger.
And this gets into, in your book, I think, you talk about how progressives might have some hope for this, because it's showing a schism within the ranks of different conservative groups.
Yeah, I mean, the right is still fractured. The Republican Party is obviously in the most dominant position that it's been in since the 1920s, but ideologically, it's still a bit incoherent. That is, the Paul Ryan wing of the Republican Party is different from Trump's brand of right-wing populism. And then, when you think outside of just what the GOP is doing, different people who are voting Republican have very different ideas as to what they want to see come out of government. So there's not so far, I think one of the reasons why the Trump administration has been so ineffectual, besides just poor organization in the White House, is that there is not sort of a unified conservative ideology that Republicans in government or in the electorate really agree upon.
I think that Trump has a lot of credit for his ineffectuality, and it's not just the Republican or the right's problem. I think it's big part his problem.
No, I don't disagree with that. But I think an inability to make a coherent narrative has left the right in a weaker position than you'd think it would be given current Republican dominance.
You've also said that the alt-right may hate conservatives more than they hate progressives.
I think that is true in that I think they view conservatives as being a bigger stumbling block to exercising real influence than the left. That is, they know that the left will always be there, but that will always be their real long-term opponent. But they view conservatism as drawing away a lot of people that they think should rightfully be on their side. That is, that the main constituents for conservative politics remain, middle-class white people. And they think that that is the demographic that should be with the alt-right as opposed to with, people like Paul Ryan.
So how do the mainstream conservatives deal with the alt-right?
For the most part, they have been quite ferocious in attacking the alt-right from the very beginning. When the alt-right first started to appear on the scene, you would see a lot of the big conservative names come out swinging and saying that the alt-right needs to have be purged in the same way that earlier radical right-wing movements needed to be purged. The difference is that they haven't really been successful at that. So the animus between the alt-right and conservatism definitely goes both ways.
Well, the fact is that the leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, has been embracing and enticing and encouraging them. So, yeah, on one hand they're pushing away, on the other hand it's coming.
Yeah, the relationship between Trump's movement and the alt-right is a bit confusing and oftentimes ambiguous. I prefer to view them as separate phenomenon, even when they are often driven by similar sentiments. That is, Trump breaks from traditional conservatism in that his movement is ostentatiously one of right-wing populism, which differs from say, Goldwater style conservatism in important ways, but it is still categorically different from the unapologetic and open white nationalism of the alt-right. And that's not a defense of Trump. It's simply saying that his right-wing politics is in a separate category from the alt-right.
Well, his politics maybe, but he certainly pandered to the alt-right.
Yeah, during the campaign, there was a strange hesitancy for him to really come out swinging against the alt-right. He did finally do so in November after the infamous National Policy Institute conference where Trump supporters were throwing up Nazi salutes. That finally was the moment where he took the effort to put some distance between himself and that particular wing.
Is that really convincing?
It's hard to say. I can't really get in.
Oh, you're freezing up there. Sometimes you're locked
with the alt-right. But whether...
Oh, wait. You broke up for a second there. So I ask you, is that convincing? One of you...
I say I'm not entirely sure what was going through Trump's mind at that point. I think that all of his denunciations of the alt-right have been rather perfunctory, which is rather surprising, because it seems like it would be politically beneficial for him to be more aggressively opposed to this element of his support.
Perfunctory. Why don't you put that in plainer English? Unbelievable.
Yeah, or half-hearted or insincere.
Okay.
So yeah, he has not been as. Although I do think his broader movement is separate from the alt-right, he has definitely been willing to play footsie with the alt-right and flirt with certain alt-right individuals to a disturbing extent.
Why? I mean, I know you're not a mind reader, but why would he do that? You're telling me that it's a very tiny movement. Why do you think he's so...
Sorry, I think my internet connection must have gone unstable again. I missed your last question.
Okay. Why do you think he is so engaging with them? Why is he so willing to really damage his big picture reputation by supporting them by his silence or by his remarks?
I'm not quite sure what the strategy is there, especially since in terms of actual policies, the Trump administration, aside from the Muslim ban, has not really been a particularly alt-right friendly administration. That is, especially now with Bannon gone, there's not a lot of people that the alt-right has any interest in working in the White House right now. So my best guess is he doesn't view them as his primary adversary, and he'd rather aim his fire at other folks that he considers a bigger problem for him, like the media, which seems to be his primary focus. And so I think there might be a little bit of a I don't really want to engage in too much psychoanalysis, but this might be a thing where if the media declares that the alt-right is evil, perhaps he's thinking, well, maybe there must be something good about them.
So you mentioned Bannon, Steve Bannon. Now, I think you've said that you don't think he's part of the alt-right, but what is the relationship between Bannon and the alt-right? You just kind of said that him leaving the White House cost some interest on the part of the alt-right. And then let's also tie that in with Breitbart, where Bannon went back to. Okay.
Yeah, I think that Breitbart can fit more so in the category of Trumpist right-wing populism than in the ideological racism of the alt-right. But there were elements of Breitbart that repeated a lot of the talking points that you would find on the alt-right about things such as minority crime and the dangers of Islam, although the alt-right is less interested in the Islam question per se, that showed that it was, in some ways, there was some ideological overlap between what Breitbart was pushing and what the hardcore of the alt-right was pushing. And certainly the fact that Breitbart published an article by Milo Yiannopoulos that basically said that the alt-right was basically a bunch of harmless pranksters, that indicated that even if it didn't align itself with the alt-right, it didn't really view it as a problem or something that it had to put a lot of distance from. Though that might be changing with Breitbart, even with Bannon back at the helm, because it seemed as though post-election the site was trying to professionalize a little bit and bring in some more mainstream conservative editors and writers.
You think that might be the effect of Robert Mercer's ownership in it?
It could be. I don't know enough about sort of what the goings on are over there.
How about Alex Jones, Prison Planet, Joseph Watson, that crew?
Well, that is also, I think, a different animal. It's conspiracy-minded stuff is in some way reminiscent of what the alt-right is about. For example, both the Prison Planet folks and the alt-right will use the term globalists a lot. Now, when the alt-right uses the term globalist, they always use that as a code word or just directly as a term that they mean for Jews. Whereas if there is any major anti-Semitism on the part of people like Alex Jones, it's never made explicit in that same way.
Okay. Have the alt-right seen any successes? I would gauge that success would mean that some message or meme or narrative that they've been pushing have been embraced in some way by a larger segment of the population or the media. I'm thinking of Black Lives Matter and how that has been vilified. But anything else, too?
I think that one of the big successes of the alt-right was the successful meme that Hillary Clinton was in extraordinarily poor health and possibly dying back in mid-2016. That was obviously a message that was not explicitly racial or even implicitly racial, but it was a message that was very aggressively pushed by the alt-right and also by figures that sort of overlapped a little bit with the alt-right, such as Mike Cernovich and some of these other folks that have come to be called alt-light.
Alt-light, it's another question I've got written down. What's alt-light?
The alt-light is, I would say it's a movement that is not as ideologically committed to anything as the alt-right proper is, but it is a movement that sort of uses similar tactics as the alt-right and lives predominantly online, loves to troll, engages in some conspiracy theory type stuff, but generally avoids explicit racism in the way that the alt-right does. So you would put people, I would say, like Mike Cernovich in that category, people like Milo Yiannopoulos in that category, maybe even just Breitbart in general might fit in that category, or at least for a time it did.
What are their goals?
What's that?
What are their goals?
Well, they, as I say, their ideological commitments are not always clear. I think that they favor a nationalist message that's not necessarily tied to race. So they definitely love the Trumpist talking point of America first. So immigration restrictionism without necessarily calls for mass deportation, things like new trade barriers, things like opposition to political correctness on campus and in the media and in other places, and a whole laundry list of things that can sometimes overlap with what the alt-right is saying and sometimes overlap with what mainstream conservatives are saying.
Okay. Is there a connection between alt-right and white Christians? There was just an article by Amanda Marcotte, I sent it to you this morning, where the new study showed that only 43% of Americans are white Christians now. A big drop, huge drop from the 70s. Yes,
I've been seeing those same numbers, and I generally view the Christian right as being yet again a separate entity from the alt-right. The alt-right, I would say, is probably actually more secular on average than the United States as a whole. There are Christians in the alt-right, and you can find Christian alt-right websites and podcasts. I'm not saying it's a totally secular movement, but for the most part, its ideology is not rooted in religion. And in fact, quite a number of folks within the alt-right are extraordinarily hostile to Christianity for a number of reasons and actually think the decline of Christianity could be a good thing.
So they're opposed to Jews and Muslims and Christians even?
Well,
the same?
The opposition to Christianity that you see on the right is usually rooted in sort of a Nietzschean perspective that is viewing Christianity as being inherently egalitarian, which they reject. And Christianity is, in the eyes of many of them, a problem because it ultimately has Jewish roots. And so that...
Jesus?
Yes. That both of those things make Christianity problematic. Though, again, that's not the case for all of the alt-right. And it is also worth noting that that is not a new perspective within the radical right. When we think about people like William Pierce, who ran the National Alliance, and various other neo-Nazi outfits, there was an intense hostility to Christianity that can be found. But on the other hand, you have the KKK, which presents itself as an explicitly Protestant organization. So the relationship between the racial right, or the racist right, and Christianity has evolved over time and is different for different groups.
So now, you've said that the alt-right is not violent.
Well, at the time that I wrote those words, that was, for the most part, true, in that the alt-right had not really engaged in anything significant offline. Obviously, there are plenty of cases of racist violence. There always have been. But in terms of finding examples of major violence directly inspired by the alt-right, until recently, it would be very hard to name such cases. Now, I'm not going to speak about criminal trials that will shortly be ongoing, but if it does turn out that the attacks in Charlottesville were premeditated and it was an attempt at racial terrorism, racist terrorism, that would represent a turn in the alt-right.
Were they alt-right, those people there?
I would say that most of the people engaged in the actual demonstration element of it would probably identify with the alt-right. There were elements there that you could say are outgrowths of earlier manifestations of white supremacist movements. I know that there were elements of, say, the National Socialist movement that were there. Apparently, there were some KKK.
They're Nazis, right?
Yes. There were open neo-Nazis there, open KKK members there, which the alt-right refers to that as white nationalism 1.0. So that there was a contingent there, and there was also an element of the militia movement there as well. And it looked like most of that element was there to sort of not necessarily part of the rally itself, but to be sort of a neutral observer party.
Yeah, I don't buy that. Sorry.
Yeah, the militia movement is also a different animal, one that also overlaps with white supremacist groups, but there are militia movements that are not invariably racist. There's actually, I believe, a pretty good Washington Post article about this just a couple of days ago.
It's interesting parsing.
Well, a lot of it, of the militia movement, which is not really what I study, comes from a really radical anti-government, extreme libertarianism that often does have a racist element to it, but there are militia groups that don't show much interest in that side of the ideological spectrum.
Well, talking about libertarians, I really never got a clear picture of the connection between libertarians and alt-right. Get into that.
Today, there is very little. However, the mainstream libertarian movement has rather aggressively denounced the alt-right because the alt-right is openly a statist movement. They believe in using government to create a demographic racial balance that they want to see, which is obviously anathema to libertarian thinking. But a lot of the current alt-right did at one point associate themselves with libertarianism. That is, it seems like a common denominator among a lot of the present alt-right was favorable towards, say, Ron Paul in 2008, and less extent in 2012, but especially in 2008. So it seems that a number of people have moved out of libertarian circles and into alt-right circles. So that would be the main connection there now.
Okay. Pepe. Talk about Pepe.
Well, that would be an example of sort of a meme that developed without any central direction. That was an image that I believe originated on MySpace. I think during the Bush years before.
A frog. It's like a picture of a frog.
Yeah, just a picture of a cartoon frog that has no ideological content whatsoever, but over time ended up getting adopted as a mascot by the alt-right. And it's
actually a bar in the Caribbean, Pepe, that has a big statue that I went to probably 10, 15 years ago. I saw it. Anyway, I saw it though.
Yeah, and it was one of those things that got adopted not because it really meant anything, but because a critical mass of the alt-right started to think it was funny, and they found it amusing to dress him up in various racist outfits, etc. And it sort of took on a life of its own. But I think that speaks more broadly to the point of the alt-right's rather successful rebranding during the last couple of years especially, that is trying to present itself as being sort of this ironic, almost playful movement that you're not really sure how seriously to take it, to sort of move away from the angry imagery of the swastika and the burning cross, and instead present itself as a kind of part of the broader troll culture that you find.
Yeah, in your book, you talk about Pepe as being a frog that wets himself and dribbles down his leg.
Yeah, that was one of the original cartoons that he appeared in.
And how does that fit in?
It doesn't really, is the thing, is that it's the way that some of these memes sort of survive and and become just part of alt-right culture seems to mostly be based on the degree to which the people find them amusing and share them on places like 4chan, as opposed to somebody looking at that and deciding that will be really good marketing.
So, but I'm still not clear on how the alt-right uses Pepe. How does the alt-right use Pepe?
It mostly is used in things like Twitter avatars and put in, just being made for various cartoons. I don't think he has a lot of particular use except as basically a symbol of the alt-right.
But I'm not clear exactly. So if I see somebody with a Pepe avatar or in their Twitter account, let's say, what does it tell me about them?
It tells you that they are at least sympathetic to the alt-right. There might have been a time where that wasn't the case before it had really been appropriated and owned by the alt-right. And in fact, there was a time last year where the original creator of the cartoon tried to take it back and say that this does not have any racial meaning, but that was unsuccessful. So if you see a Pepe online, know that is that you're seeing a symbol that is now completely owned by the alt-right.
Does it have anything to do with racism? I mean, it's a frog. I mean, it's green. Does it have to do with color or?
As far as I can tell, no. It's just the way internet memes can survive and grow without direction. Because if somebody had said, say, in 2013, like, okay, I've created our perfect symbol, here it is, I think everybody would have scratched their heads. But sort of in the weird ecosphere that is especially right-wing message boards, like the poll board through 4chan, some of these things can, in a way, sort of take on a life of their own. We see other examples of this where the alt-right made the Moon Man from the 1980s McDonald's commercials, another one of their symbols. And similarly, a lot of them have embraced anime, which is also something that is obviously ideologically neutral as part of their symbolism.
Okay. You got a lot of media attention after Charlottesville. What were the big questions, the most common questions that you were being asked, and the most important things that had to be taught, that you feel had to Charlottesville?
I think we got cut off a little bit there. My internet connection was something.
I'll say it again. You got a lot of attention in Charlottesville. After Charlottesville, you were interviewed a lot. What kind of questions you asked, and what were the important issues that you discussed?
Well, one of the things that people keep on asking is about various alt-right groups. And one thing I want to emphasize is that when speaking about the alt-right, it's not really appropriate to use the language of groups. I mean, there are some alt-right organizations that have real members, thinking about things like Identity Europa and a few others like that. But it is still very loosely organized. There's not really, a leadership cast. There are some people who get interviewed again and again, but there's not, say, anyone at the top issuing orders that other people will listen to.
Kind of like I read about you talking about that. It reminded me of Occupy in a way.
Yeah, to some extent. And when we think about the origins of the alt-right, a lot of what we're seeing is a reaction to what was going on during the Obama years, and sort of almost a radical right equivalent to things that were going on the left. And I want to make it very clear, I'm not engaging in any sort of victim blaming or being critical of these other movements. But when we think about things like the Trayvon Martin shooting or Michael Brown or some of these other things that were catalysts for the Black Lives Matter movement, what was being less visible at the time was that on the right, on the radical right, this was a catalyst for people moving in a more radically racist direction, arguing that they were looking at the exact same facts as the people who were motivated to start Black Lives Matter, but they interpreted them in an entirely different way and viewed it as evidence that it was that white Americans were in fact the ones who were under siege and needed to become more.
Looks like you're breaking up again.
Was similar to what you saw with Black Lives Matter, though even less organized than that.
Okay. Now, I asked you before about the successes that they'd had, and you mentioned that they had a message about Hillary being ill during the campaign. Are there other ways that they've had any successes that have gone beyond their limited direct internet presence that's been picked up, let's say, by conservative media?
I think for the most part, especially since the election was over, I'd say for the most part, no, they've not. They've been pretty ineffectual, I think, since Trump took office. The problem was that, they had organized, to the extent that they organized, almost everything around trying to promote Trump and get him elected. After that was accomplished, though I think that their role was fairly minor, it wasn't really clear what the alt-right was going to do next, because there is a limit to what, anonymous trolling online can accomplish. And it became clear that it wasn't doing much in terms of actually shaping policy. So we've seen this year an increased effort, most dramatically in Charlottesville, of course, but there were other instances of trying to move off the internet and into the real world. And so far,
the other day, some people were arrested in Portland. Somebody was backing up a truck at 40 miles an hour going towards counter-protesters. So there is more stuff going on.
Mm-hmm. Though it seems like the Portland demonstrations have not gotten that much interest from the alt-right proper. But yes, there's more efforts to sort of make their presence known in the real world. But the problem is that they haven't really found a way to do that would be any more effective than what the KKK or the neo-Nazis were doing a decade before, which is not effective at all in terms of actually drawing people into their side. So they want to get away from, being this purely online phenomenon, but they don't really know how to do that without just going backwards to what was to what was even less effective than they were as a group of internet trolls.
Well, and another question I have is, when it comes to marijuana, the critics say that it's a gateway drug and it gets people into using other harder drugs. And I wonder, is the alt-right a gateway ideology or way of thinking that gets people more likely to embrace white supremacism or white nationalism or the KKK or any of those more violent, more aggressively hateful ways?
Well, I mean, ideologically, I'd say the alt-right is the same as those other movements. That is, the ultimate vision of the alt-right of, some degree of a future racially pure society is not any different from the ideology of those other groups you just mentioned. So I don't think it's really a gateway in terms of ideas, but whether or not it would be a gateway towards more militant action and real world violence.
That's what
I think that is a real possibility. On the other hand, things could also be going in the other direction, right? That is that perhaps people who might have gone out and joined one of these much more dangerous racist groups might decide that they're
We lost you again.
That's enough. So I'm not sure what the long term meaning of this will be in terms of.
Wait a second. You broke up. We lost you a second there again. So you were starting to say about how, it looks like you're frozen again. No, you're not. All right, you're sitting very still. So you were starting to say about how it could actually diminish the people's connection to the more violent groups.
I mean, possibly. I don't want to say anything that's, you know, an endorsement of the alt-right, but even some groups that monitor, you know, hate groups will acknowledge that, you know, most of the, you know, white supremacist keyboard warriors aren't ever going to actually do anything in the real world. So to some extent, the fact that there's this alt-right where they can go blow off steam and then go back to whatever they were doing before might actually be, from everyone else's perspective, better than people who go out and say join a skinhead gang or something like that.
Makes sense. We're getting close to the end of this conversation. You want to wrap up with any final observations?
No. Well, I guess I would end by saying that although the alt-right is definitely something that should be kept a close eye on, I think it has definitely hit a plateau in terms of growth. And it's not entirely clear how long it's going to even be a well-known sort of brand in the right-wing ecosphere. So, you know, I'm not telling, I guess my thing is Americans have a bad habit of blowing things out of proportion and overreacting, thinking about our overreaction to, during the McCarthy era, our overreaction after 9/11. I would caution against overreaction about the alt-right, especially, you know, people now saying, okay, because the alt-right exists, that means that we now need to have really aggressive censorship of the internet. I think that might be something to look into the future, but I think we should approach those sorts of things with extreme caution, because we do have a tendency to overestimate problems.
I would agree. My first reaction to them taking down Stormfront was, oh, yay, good thing. But thinking about it, it's that old Bishop Niemoller quote. You know, first they came for them, then them, then them, and then when they came for me, nobody was left to protect me. I think we really got to think about freedom of speech as an absolute, and that's important. You know, the other thing that I've seen that it's kind of a side angle, but some moderate Democrats have been characterizing progressives as alt-left. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's a mistake. I think that I do think that moderate progressives have every right to and have a good reason to denounce the excesses of things like Antifa, which I have many criticisms of myself. But I think that they should use a different terminology.
Well, I got to jump in because I'm very interested in Antifa. I'm not convinced that there's a real organized Antifa, and I would love to know if you can refer me to some ways of making it clear. I think that a lot of the violent stuff that's come from the left has been the black anarchists, but I'd love to hear otherwise from you.
Well, I know that a book just came out on Antifa by a scholar who knows the movement extraordinarily well, and I've not yet had a chance to really dig into it, but I do know that there are organized chapters of Antifa around a large number of major cities. Probably the main platform for Antifa online is a website called It's Going Down. So if you wanted to visit that could provide a little bit of information about sort of the Antifa worldview and the logic of their particular tactics.
There's a redneck website and group organization with chapters in various cities too that I think is trying to glom onto the Antifa narrative as well. I'm still not convinced that what we have here in the United States is anything like the Antifa that's existing in Europe.
Yeah, and like the alt-right, you know, the Antifa is a much smaller movement than you would realize watching media coverage.
Probably a lot smaller even than alt-right.
Could be. but they are able to organize and show up in, at least moderate numbers whenever these various, alt-right gatherings occur. So they are organized enough to at least make their presence known across the country. So that's something that, in that regard, they're at least the equivalent of the alt-right in terms of that degree of organizational ability.
Okay, well, got to wrap. It's been the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show. My guest has been George Hawley, Assistant Professor of Political Science at University of Alabama and author of Making Sense of the Alt-Right. His new book just came out. Thanks, George.
Thank you.